Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton. Today we are back with Ken Griffith, the co-author with Darrell White of the Chronological Framework of Ancient History series, published at Answers Research Journal. This is a new model of ancient history that is compatible with the Usher-Jones chronology using the Latin Vulgate and the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. In this episode, we are going to look at Ken's chronology for Egypt from the dispersion after Babel down to the period of the Exodus. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Hamilton. It's an honor to be here.
Could you just remind us of the role that city dynasties play in restructuring our interpretation of Manetho's system and how that differs from the conventional interpretation of Egyptian chronology?
Certainly. So Manetho was a Egyptian priest who he basically wrote the history of Egypt as a series of dynasties around the time of maybe two generations after Alexander the Great, maybe 280 BC. And his list of dynasties has become the backbone of ancient history. And what we argue is that his dynasties were not intended to be understood as a series, but that he was listing the dynasties of multiple cities, just like if you could potentially write a book listing the governors of all the states of the United States, starting with Virginia, then Massachusetts, and then so on. If you strung those out in a list as a long series, you might say that the United States has 2,000 years of history, when the reality is it only has about 250 years of history. So what we find in Genesis 10 lists Mizraim, his 6 sons and 2 grandsons, as the progenitors of what would become the Egyptian civilization. And of those, at least one of his sons settled in Canaan, and they were the Philistines. So that reduces the number by one. And then 2 of his sons were apparently twins, and their animal totem was the twin falcons. So they apparently built one city together, and thus we might expect between 6 and 8 founding tribes or cities of Egypt.
And could you just clarify what an animal totem is for our viewers?
Um, so an animal totem would be like a frog, or basically it means that that's like the mascot of your city, although they didn't use the word mascot, but they use it as the symbol of their tribe. So an example might be some people are familiar from the mummy of a king named Scorpion. Um, I think the Scorpion King is what they call him, but basically the scorpion was the symbol for that king's name in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Um, so I'm gonna share my screen with you, and hopefully it'll work. And okay, so what we have, this on the left is a map of Egypt. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. What we have is the Nile River here, and actually it flows in this direction to the north. And the Nile Delta actually wasn't even there when Menes first came to Egypt around 2188 BC, or Min. And there are inscriptions in the Wadi Hammamat, with this picture is here below, a petroglyph of a boat, people sailing, actually it's a catamaran. And apparently the original colonists of Egypt, they sailed up the Red Sea. They had come from the Persian Gulf, apparently, where the Euphrates and the Tigris run in. And they came to this location, and they walked up the Wadi Hammamat, which is a valley between these 2 points. And the oldest cities in Egypt were actually founded right around this bend of the river. There's one called Nakada right at the bend. There's one called Thinis, which was the first dynasty of Egypt, which hasn't actually been found, but it's right around just downstream of the bend. And Thebes is upstream of the bend, and then there's another one called Necker, I think, just upstream of Thebes. So you have the oldest cities in Egypt there. But what we find is the Egyptians themselves documented this in the first dynasty. We have this artifact called the Libyan palette. The palettes were used by people, basically priests in the temple, to put makeup on their idols to make it look like they were alive. So makeup was not invented for women; it was invented for idols. But anyway, this was a palette. It's been broken in half. The palette was used for the makeup that they used to mix and then apply with a brush. And so they every year they would make a palette with art on it depicting what had happened the previous year, and then they would give that to the temple. And so
And
these appear to be,
this dates from
go
the
ahead.
pre-dynastic period?
It does, yes. So this is the backside of the Libyan palette, and it's partly broken, but we can see that there are each of these little squares with crenellations around it represents a city. And so there are 7 cities depicted here, and each city has an animal or other symbol on the inside, as well as some of them have an animal symbol above them. Like this is a baboon, that's a scorpion. So maybe the Scorpion King might have been king of this city. Um, and we propose that these are the 7 founding tribes of Mizraim when they founded the cities of Egypt around 2188 BC, roughly in the decade or two after that. And then there's another palette. This is called the Narmer palette. We believe this dates from 21, roughly 2180 BC. It, sorry, not 2180, 2160. This was about the 28th year of Menes when Narmer came to Egypt and he brought hieroglyphic writing. He taught them how to write. And he also helped his uncle Menes to conquer all the other cities in Egypt and basically make one nation out of them. And so the Narmer palette depicts him conquering Upper and Lower Egypt. See, he's wearing right now the crown of one of the 2 kingdoms, and on the flip side, he's wearing the other crown.
So a lot of Egyptologists will suggest that Narmer and Menes are the same person. Could you just clarify your understanding of their relationship?
Yeah, so Min has been universally believed by church fathers to have been Mizraim, and Nimrod, I believe, was Narmer. Enmer was his name in the Middle East, and when he came to Egypt, that was only one vowel shift or one consonant shift from Enmer to Narmer. Enmer meant Lord Storm, or the storm god, basically. Um, so he basically helped his uncle conquer the whole country, and they became co-regents when they built the city of Memphis after their victory. And so I would think that they are 2 people, and the fact that you have some pottery that shows both the cartouche of Narmer and also Hor-Aha, which some people think was Min, it could mean that they were the same person, or it could mean that you had co-regents, and I believe they were co-regents. So um, there's a lot more about the first dynasty that I don't want to get into in this particular lecture, but we will go back to it later when we do the Euhemerist lecture toward the end.
Sure.
Okay. So the third palette, Nimrod's policy was to unite everybody into one, and the third palette is the bull palette, and this probably symbolizes the king defeating his enemy. This is, an enemy warrior who's been being gored by a bull, and we see this rope, and the rope has these 5 hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands grasping the rope, and each hand has a little banner which has one of those animal symbols of those cities that we saw on the Libyan palette. So again, this is a symbol that he's united the tribes of Egypt into one, and that was his propaganda, and that was his policy. So that concludes my answer to that question.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about who was reigning in Egypt when Abraham came into the land, when Abraham met Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh was struck by plagues after he seized Sarai? It's in Genesis 12 for our viewers.
Okay.
Who was this Pharaoh, and how do we know that?
Well, we find evidence that there were 3 main dynasties ruling in Egypt at that time. You had in in Thinis, which is far to the south, you had the second dynasty had just replaced the first. Abraham's visit to Egypt was 1921 BC, and the apparently there was a shift from the first to the second in 1925 BC. We also date that as the same year that the first dynasty the third transitioned into the fourth. So there you had one of the early kings of the second dynasty, and there's a city called Heracleopolis, which is obviously a Greek name for an Egyptian city that's roughly in the middle of the Nile between Memphis and Thinis. And there you had a king, I think his name was Bebi or something similar to Bebi. There was a king reigning there. But in Memphis, you actually had the fourth dynasty where Khufu and his son Khafre were co-reigning. So the picture here on the right, that is an ivory depiction of Khufu, and on the left is a depiction of Khafre, his son. And we believe that they were co-reigning, and although I'm not sure if Khafre had yet come as co-regent when Abraham got there, but we suspect that Abraham, most likely his interaction was with Khufu. And Khufu, I'm going to show you this is our timeline for the first basically 700 years from the dispersion to the Exodus, which was 1491 BC. And we find, so basically that you've got multiple tribes ruling. So Abraham's interaction was with Dynasty 3 of, Dynasty 4 of Memphis. Okay. Here's a better picture as well that kind of depicts it. So Abraham is visiting roughly early in the reign of Khufu. And Herodotus recorded that there was a king, a shepherd visiting Egypt named Philition or Philetus, which means friend, and that he was the one who designed or built the Great Pyramid. And I suspect that the truth behind this might be that the Khufu was said to have offended the gods. He repented. He also has a weird story where his daughter was sent to work in a brothel to raise money to build the pyramid, which doesn't make any sense. I suspect that what they've done is that they've corrupted the story of Sarah um, being corrupted by Khufu, basically taking her as his wife, and the gods getting angry, and basically the true God being angry and cursing him, and cursing his livestock and his women. That got kind of twisted into the story of Khufu sending his daughter to the brothel. That's my opinion, but obviously that's not a concrete and easily proved theory. But the theory that Phileton is a reference to Abraham goes back to the 1800s, and I think it's plausible, but I'm not going to say it definitely was Khufu.
Okay, and Josephus also says something about Abraham instructing the Egyptians in certain things like mathematics and astronomy. Do you think that that's an evidence at this point?
Definitely. So there's Josephus saying that. I believe there's another source to that as well. We believe Abraham came from Haran, and just north of Haran was the city of Urfa, which I believe, and Cyrus Gordon believed was Ur of the Chaldees. Next to Urfa was Göbekli Tepe, and we place Abraham's departure toward the end of the pre-Pottery Neolithic in that area. So if Abraham grew up in that region, he very well could have learned astronomy at Göbekli Tepe. It literally would have been 15 miles from where he was born. And therefore, him bringing that knowledge to Egypt right when they were designing the Great Pyramid is very plausible. In fact, the Great Pyramid has far more evidence of mathematical and astronomical sophistication than any of the ones before or after it. So something unusual happened when the Great Pyramid was built, but I don't want to get too far into that either because so many people have turned the Great Pyramid almost into a cult, meaning they have
Sure.
just really weird stuff about it. So
So, moving a little forward in Genesis shows us a number of different famines. And then, of course, it comes to its climax with the 7-year famine during the life of Joseph. Do these famines show up in extra biblical history? Do they show up in Egyptian history? And how exactly do you tie all this together with Egyptian chronology?
well, as it turns out, there are multiple famines, 7-year famines mentioned, or I should say that they're mentioned in multiple dynasties of Egypt, as well as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we even have in the Bible, there's two 7-year famines, the first being Joseph's and the second being in the time of Elisha. So the question is, which 7-year famine was the one of Joseph? Are all these the same, or were there more than one? This is a picture from our chart, the master chart of ancient history, that you can download off of our website, or excuse me, my academia page. And what we have found when we put all these together is that we have a reference to a famine in the time of the first dynasty in Uanephis, and also in the time of Djoser of the third dynasty, who built the step pyramid at Saqqara. And we find that this one also corresponds to the 7-year famine mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Jacob of Edessa said that Abraham's father Terah that suffered a 7-year famine, and that Abraham was born in the middle of that 7-year famine. So we date that one from 2001 BC until 1994 BC. And that's when Gilgamesh was reigning in the third dynasty, as in the first dynasty, as Abydos. And in the third dynasty, it was the transition from the reign of Djoser to his successor. And then we have another famine, 7-year famine, which we believe is the one of Joseph. And this famine is mentioned in the second dynasty, the fifth dynasty, and the 12th. And we, as you can see from our chart here, we actually have also the 10th, the 13th, and 14th. We believe all of these were basically existent at the time, but we don't have good records from the other dynasties. So mainly we have Unas from the fifth dynasty saying that in his reign, no one died from the famine, or people didn't suffer from the famine because he had food for them. You also have a mention of it that at the end, Bebi was the last guy of the second dynasty, and there was a famine in his reign. And then we also have in the reign of Senusret the first, there's a reference by one of his servants who worked and helped prevent people from starving from the famine. So basically, we believe that 3 of these famine references are all Joseph's famine, and that this was the 12th dynasty. So, one more thing to mention before that. So this first 7-year famine that's mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's also mentioned, the Egyptians remembered it as the book of the heavenly cow. They believe that something happened where the bull of heaven mentioned in Gilgamesh is the constellation Taurus. And they believe something happened where the bull of heaven struck the earth and caused this horrible disaster. And it was such a traumatic event that it entered into the myths and legends of both the Egyptians and the people in the Middle East. And I believe that God used that first 7-year famine to prepare the way for Joseph. So 300 years later, when the Pharaoh has a dream and he sees these, 7 fat cows and then 7 skinny cows, and then Joseph tells him the interpretation of the dream is that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh's reaction is, "Oh, a 7-year famine. Quick, we got to do something. Let's make this guy, let's put this man in charge." So he's immediately ready to believe that a 7-year famine could happen because they remembered it from only 300 years earlier. So this is the depiction of Gilgamesh defeating the bull of heaven, which they believed caused the first famine. So this is a depiction of Senusret the first, or Sesostris the first, who we believe was Pharaoh Morris, who Joseph served. And that would be the remains of the pyramid of Unas, he was ruling in Memphis at the same time that this pharaoh was ruling the 12th dynasty over all of Egypt. So,
so to clarify what you say, so you think that the kings in Memphis at this point in time were clients of the kings of the 12th dynasty?
exactly.
Okay.
And the 12th dynasty had originally, the 11th dynasty had started in Thebes, but the 12th built a new capital in a city today called Lisht. And then they also had a court in the Delta. So Joseph's interactions were probably in the Delta, although once he was raised to the Grand Vizier, he probably was working all over Egypt. I should probably state my Grand Vizier theory. Did you want to ask your question about Mentuhotep?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess you've already mentioned you think Joseph's pharaoh was Sesostris the third, and I'm just interested in what you think about whether Joseph is present in Egyptian records, because Dr. Corville the author, for the viewers, of Exodus, Problem and Ramifications. It's a 2 volume set on Egyptian chronology. He identifies Joseph with one of the viziers of Sesostris I, a gentleman named Mentuhotep. And so I was wondering what your take on that is, and more broadly, whether you think we can identify Joseph within Egyptian records themselves.
Sure. So what we found was, it appears to us, based on our paper number 6, it looks to us that Dynasty 13 and Dynasty 14 were both founded around the time that Joseph became the vizier, with 13 being about 8 or 9 years earlier. Our interpretation of that is that the 13th dynasty was essentially the new position of Grand Vizier created by Senusret to help him rule the kingdom, and that Joseph was the first, maybe not the first, but probably the first of those Grand Viziers. And so Corville identifies Euphne, who is one of the 13th dynasty kings, as also being readable as Joseph, so or Yusuf, and he had a paper on that in the mid 70s. So if you look at this time, you've got in the 5th dynasty, Unis, I believe his vizier was Ptahhotep, or his father's vizier possibly, and then you also have Mentuhotep and another gentleman in the 12th dynasty who were viziers of Senusret I. Mentuhotep looks to me like a pagan, but then again, Joseph might look like a pagan if we found him, because he's basically the right hand man of a king who's worshipped as a god in a church state religious system that's basically paganism. So how would we recognize Joseph if we saw him? I'm not sure. The I think it is Douglas Petrovich has interpreted the Esbet Rushdie stele as a king Senusret giving basically charge of the house to a man named Sobek something. And he's interpreted that as proof that Joseph was ruling in the reign of Senusret III, whereas we would say it was Senusret I. At any rate, my belief, my theory at this point is that Dynasty 13 was the super vizier position, and that if you look at the viziers of Dynasty 11, 12, and 5, you'll find Joseph's contemporaries who were viziers of those dynasties at the time, that he was the super vizier of Dynasty 13. And what made him different was he actually had the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt. All of these dynasties, a true king in the dynasty would have that title, King of Upper and Lower Egypt. And when you look at Genesis, where Pharaoh commissions Joseph, he basically says, "You are me. You are. No one may lift their finger in the whole country apart from your word, because I am giving you this authority." And I think that is actually why he was given that title. And that was basically the beginning of the 13th dynasty. Now, could be wrong about that. The problem with the 13th dynasty is we have very little information. We have a list of kings of 13th dynasty from the Turin canon, and then a few inscriptions from some of them, but we don't really have a consistent, coherent list that says the order of the kings or the length of their reigns or anything like that.
It's from what I know, it's a bit of an odd dynasty in just the number of kings that are listed as members of the 13th dynasty. So something seems to be going on there.
Yeah.
So take us then down from the reign or the viziership, whatever you want to call it, Joseph, down to the beginning of the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt.
Okay. Well, in our chart here, we have Amenemhat the first and Senusret the first. Joseph became the Grand Vizier basically while Amenemhat I was still alive, but he suffered from an assassination attempt, and that's what led to Joseph being pulled out of prison, because it was the baker and the the wine taster who had been put on trial, because apparently in his assassination attempt, first they poisoned him, or they drugged him, and then he was attacked in his bedroom, and he was kind of in a dreamlike state because of whatever drug they gave him. But he was able to fight them off, but he was still kind of I guess, disabled by the wounds that he suffered for the rest. So he basically went into retirement, and Senusret I becomes the main um, king until his father died. So then you have actually three more kings of the 12th dynasty until Joseph dies, and Senusret III is the first after the death of Joseph, and we believe he is the king who knew not Joseph. And then so we believe Senusret III spent most of his reign fighting wars overseas, or I should not really overseas, but next door, and that Amenemhet III was co-reigning with him, his son, but that you also had a king of the 13th dynasty named Khan Nefer. Well, first there was Neferhotep, Neferhotep I, and then he died, and his little brother Khan Neferri, Sobek-Hotep, becomes the king of the 13th. And we believe these two kings are acting in the same capacity to Senusret III and Amenemhet III that Joseph had acted to Senusret I. And part of the evidence of that, sorry, this is Senusret III. We believe he was the pharaoh who decreed to kill the infants. And interestingly, Neferhotep I, who's a 13th dynasty king, there are two cases of his inscription right next to the inscription of Senusret III, and in the same style, same size, everything, as if he's almost equal with the guy. And current archaeologists say, yeah, this guy, he was obsessed with being associated with Senusret III, and we would say that's because he was his right-hand man. They were the same administration. Senusret III was like the president, and this guy was like the vice president, effectively. That's how it was working. And so we think that's why they're found together. So then Neferhotep dies, and his little brother, Khan-Neferre, we believe he married the daughter of Amenhotep, sorry, not Amenhotep, Amenemhet III, and the daughter's name was Sobek-Neferui. And Sobek-Neferui, we believe, was the barren daughter of the pharaoh. And so they adopted Moses. And sorry, I don't want to get too far ahead here. Let's go back here. So she's Sobek-Neferui, and she adopts Moses. And Amenemhet III is still reigning for most of this time. And we believe that Moses was the king Amenemhet IV. And Corville was the first to make this argument, and we agree with him. We think he was correct. And we actually have we found additional evidence that it is correct. So Amenemhet III built this temple to this goddess of the Nile, and there's a statue with an inscription of him together with Amenemhet IV, saying that the goddess of the Nile had given them Amenemhet IV, and which is pretty openly saying, a way of them justifying Amenemhet III has no heir, and they have this non-Egyptian kid who came out of the Nile, and they're making him the heir and saying that the goddess of the Nile is the one who decreed it. We also have enough information about Amenemhet IV. We know the name of his mother, and it was not Sobek-Neferui, and it is recognizable as Jochebed. It's something Apeti. So the Egyptian, basically it's been transliterated into Egyptian, but you can actually recognize the mother of Amenemhet IV as being Jochebed. So by the time that the Exodus came, and this is, again, we agree with Corville's findings on this, the 12th dynasty died out, because after Amenemhet IV disappeared, Sobek-Neferui rules for 3 more years, and then the 12th dynasty is extinct. But in the 6th dynasty, you had Pepi II, or Pepi the Great, and he reigned 96 years total, or it might have been 94. I believe he was made king when he was 6 years old, and he reigned, and he died at the age of 100. So he was a young man when all this happened with Amenemhet IV, and I believe that he was the one who was hunting Moses's life. So when God comes to Moses in the desert and calls him out to come back to Egypt, he says, "Those who were seeking your life are dead." And I believe it was specifically a reference to Pepi II. So Pepi II had a son named Merenre II, or Re Nemti Emsaf. These Egyptian names are so much fun. Tongue twisters. This guy, he apparently had a few years of co-reign with his father, but as sole pharaoh, he only lasted a year. And supposedly he was killed by his enemies, and his wife, Nitocris, who is found in the records as Netjerkeri, which is a man's name. But there are several records that his wife, Nitocris, uh, avenged his death. She became queen upon his death, and she avenged him by creating an underground chamber and then inviting all of her husband's enemies to a banquet in this chamber. And then while they were in there, she left the room and opened the floodgates and flooded it and drowned them. And I find it's quite interesting that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was drowned in the Red Sea. And so she's taking revenge on the enemies of her husband by drowning them. And it looks to me like she was trying to do lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. At any rate, Corville finds that there's a 13th dynasty king named Tonkaris or Ka-Ankh-Ra Sobekotep. And he thinks he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And we actually agree that he died in the year of the Exodus. It says that he died 700 years after Menes in the book of Sothis. And 700 years from the dispersion is 1491 BC. So we have two pharaohs dying the same year. And so we suspect that one of them was the one who drowned in the Red Sea, and the other one was probably killed in the night of the firstborn, the night of the angel of death that killed the firstborn sons. And we know that Merenre II, that he was the younger son of Pepi II. He was not the firstborn. But Konkaris or Ka-Ankh-Ra Sobekotep appears to have been firstborn, and he died in his 5th year. So he probably died by the angel of death. At least we might think so. The last thing that we wanted to point out was that the 14th dynasty, we believe that this was the rule of Goshen. So that there's an early king of the 14th dynasty called Yaqub Har, and that's a picture of his seal. And that there's been about 30 copies of that seal found in Canaan as well as the Delta area of Egypt. And we believe that he was the king of the 14th dynasty, that basically that was Jacob, Joseph's father, after Pharaoh gave him rule over the land of Goshen.
It's interesting to note, as James Jordan has pointed out, that if you read the genealogical information in Chronicles, it gives you some information about the period when they're dwelling in Goshen. And it makes clear that the Israelites are not just hanging out in Goshen, they're continuing to move up into Canaan and back into Goshen until the period of the oppression begins. So that would make sense that you find these seals there.
Yep. And those seals this is actually considered a Hyksos seal, and that kind of leads into your last question.
Yeah, I wanted, before we get into that, I just wanted to ask about the beginning of the oppression under Senusret III, because I believe, if I remember correctly, you've connected that to the foundation of his astronomical college. And I'm interested to hear about that if you have anything to say.
Sure. We have the dates from the Jews preserved a lot of data, and there's a book called by Ginsburg called Legends of the Jews, which is mainly basically a distillation of the Talmud, the Torah, the Midrash, and a number of Jewish sources. And they record that it was 215 years. Sorry, that they record, I believe that it was 80 years from the decree to kill the babies until the actual Exodus. And that happens to agree with some other durations that we found, that Senusret III, he spent 20 years fighting wars in Ethiopia. He comes back for a couple of years, and then he spends 9 years in Asia conquering the Middle East. And then he came back in the year, we have very precise durations to the year 1576 BC, which would be about 5 years before Moses was born. And so he comes back and he sends Egyptian astronomers to establish a college on the Euphrates. And we believe this was actually not Babylon, as Diodorus interprets it, but that it was near Carchemish, just downstream of Carchemish. There's an island in the river. And I believe that his astronomical college became later called Kadesh. and that it was the city of the worship of the sun god, which was the Egyptian religion. At any rate, that was 1776 BC, and that happens to agree with the Jewish records of the date at which the Pharaoh gave the decree to kill the babies. And apparently, the decree to kill the babies was canceled about 6 or 7 years after it was given. The oppression continued, the slavery continued, but I believe that when Moses was fished out of the river and the Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, that it was taken as a sign that they should not be killing the babies, and they stopped. So the oppression continued, though, under Amenemhet III as well as Pepi in the dynasty in Memphis.
I think actually we have there's a Jewish tradition that says the Pharaoh of the Oppression reigned for 94 years, which is quite a striking connection to the length of Pepi's reign. There's only one king in Egyptian history who would fit that time span.
Exactly. Also,
So
Artapanus says that the husband of the woman who adopted Moses was named Khenephres, and that's clearly Khan-Neferre Sobek-Hotep, who was the younger brother of Neferhotep, who was the right-hand man of Senusret III.
right.
So the number of these things, they all tie together. They really do fit quite well.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have to wonder, if these traditions are just, being made up, if they're being pulled out of thin air, why they would have connections with anything in Egyptian history. You would kind of expect it to, connect to nothing at all. The fact that it connects to specific things, I think alone is telling. So the Hyksos are major, characters in Egyptian history. They're loathed by the Egyptians. They rule over Egypt for a number of centuries, according to Egyptian traditions and, just standard Egyptian history. So tell us a little bit about who you think the Hyksos are, because there have been some people who have said, well, the Hyksos are the Israelites. That's an ancient Jewish and Egyptian view. There's some people, Velikovsky and David Roll, say the Hyksos are, or at least partially made up of the Amalekites. So who do you think the Hyksos were? How do they relate to the Bible?
I would say they're both right. Um, the Hyksos as the Israelites was used to slander the Jews in the time of Apion. Apion was a first century Roman or Greek guy, I'm not sure which, probably Greek, who wrote some slanders against the Jews, and Josephus wrote 2 books in reply to him called Against Apion. And that's actually a lot of our Egyptian sources of Manetho comes from Josephus in Against Apion. Um, what our interpretation of it is this: the Hyksos, specifically that title means shepherd king, and it was actually found on some of the seals, like the one I showed you of Jacob, Har Yakub Har, which is Jacob. You would expect that Jacob and Esau, being brothers, that the tribes descended from them would be pretty closely related in culture, especially within the first 100 years. And the early Hyksos, which we would say came in the 12th dynasty, pretty close to the start of the 12th dynasty, which was also the end of the 5th dynasty, and therefore all of the 6th dynasty. You have early Hyksos, and what I have shown you here are 2 pictures of this kind of a sword called a khopesh. This sword was used by the Akkadians, the Akkadian Empire, and we place the Akkadian Empire as also parallel to the 12th, the 6th, and the 5th dynasties. And we place the fall of Akkad about 10 years after the fall of Egypt in the Exodus, which obviously is controversial because we're lowering it down by about 700 years. But the Akkadian swords were identical to the Hyksos. The early Hyksos swords were identical, and the Hyksos are the ones who brought horses and chariots into Egypt. And the first mention of a chariot in the Bible is Joseph riding in a chariot. So we think that effectively both the Israelites and the Amalekites and the Edomites, who are all the second ones are descended from Esau, that they effectively were what the Egyptians referred to as the Hyksos. They were the shepherds, and even Genesis describes them that way, coming into the land of Goshen because the Egyptians abhor the shepherds, right? So when you had the Exodus, the Israelite Hyksos leave and they go into the wilderness, and the Amalekite Hyksos come in. And you even find we in the Manetho's king list, he has lists of the names of the first few kings of the Hyksos, and the first two are Seleucus and Kynon. Kynon, we found seals from Kynon, um, and I believe those are listed in Genesis as some of the last kings of Edomites. Saul of Rehoboth was Seleucus, and Kynon was Baal Hanan, which means Lord Hanan or Lord Kynon, basically. Um, and so the Amalekites come in, and the Amalekites, who are basically a hybrid between Canaanites and Abraham's line through Esau, they were extremely harsh masters, and they basically didn't care at all about Egyptian culture. And so they knocked down the temples, they let their animals run. All they cared about really was animals and running their animals everywhere. And of course, ruining the croplands of the Egyptian farmers and destroying things. And they were notorious for having basically totally destroyed Egypt or just run it to the ground. And it's true that for the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties, all of which we would place as that time period, and also the 8th dynasty, that there's practically nothing there. I mean, they left almost no written record of their existence because they appear to have been basically shepherds. Um, and then there's a third final period of the Hyksos. Velikovsky pointed out the synchronism that Saul's defeat of Agag, the Amalekite, appears to be the same event as Kamos of the 17th dynasty defeating or fighting against Apophis or Apop, who was the second to last of the Hyksos kings. So we believe that with Velikovsky that the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom was parallel with King Saul, David, and Solomon. But when Solomon was after his death, Tutmos III came in and he basically defeats Rehoboam, and he breaks Israel up into 4 different kingdoms that all become his client states, and those were Edom, Moab, the northern kingdom of Israel, and then Judah. And in his propaganda, where he records his campaigns on the temple, he said that he defeated the Hyksos in Canaan, in the land of Canaan. And so, to his mind, he was finishing what his ancestor, Kamos and Amos I, had done of driving the Hyksos out of Egypt. He viewed Solomon's empire as the Hyksos empire. And so he viewed defeating Rehoboam and subjugating them to him as the final defeat of the Hyksos. So obviously, there will be many strong opinions about all the things I've just said, but that's basically the integration that we had put together that seems to fit all the elements.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me if you take, because I hadn't heard that interpretation before I encountered your work, that you can take the Hyksos as a category incorporating both Israelites and Amalekites from the Egyptian point of view. But when you read Exodus, one of the things that Pharaoh is worried about is that the Israelites are going to ally with these tribes who seem to be enemies of Egypt. And that makes sense if he considers them both Hyksos. They're Hyksos in Egypt, they're Hyksos outside Egypt. Of course, he's worried that the two are going to partner up and eventually overthrow him. So I think
right.
it makes sense of a lot of otherwise curious information that you would find in the Bible. Any closing comments for today?
The one thing I didn't really cover in this episode is we didn't talk about what was going on in Sumeria and Babylon. And I would say that we also have integrated basically the Sumerian king list. It's not nearly as tight as the Egyptian dynasties because we don't have as strong synchronisms, but we do date the fall of Akkad to 1477 BC, which was about 12 years after maybe 14 years. At any rate, it was a little more than a decade after the Exodus. And basically the Amorites and the Kassites were allied tribes to the Amalekites who overran Egypt, and then they overran basically Akkad and Babylon. And the time that the time they treated that area the same way they treated Egypt is that they were notorious as being just barbarians who didn't even care about writing or the temples or the gods, and they just ran around with their sheep and their goats and their cattle, um, and destroying things and stealing everything. So we find that all of these things fit together. You have the same kind of thing happening at the same time in history, uh, all around the Middle East. Is that these nomadic tribes related descended from Abraham and Aram and possibly Arphaxad, um, and who had hybridized with the Canaanites, and they basically had been growing and growing and growing in numbers during the time that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And then when the Exodus happened, they exploded and just overran the entire Egypt and the Middle East. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this. I know we've got a lot of very enthusiastic reactions in the comments section. So I just want to mention that Ken has a free to download master charts of all of this information, which you can use as a visual aid on his academia.edu page under teaching materials. And his papers are being published progressively at answersresearchjournal.com. And the first 3 of their many papers have been published so far, so you can access and read those if you're interested in pursuing this in more detail. So thanks again for coming on, and we will see you again in a week where we're going to, I think, go down to the time of King Saul and start to talk about those synchronisms that you found between the United Kingdom of Israel and the period of Hammurabi and Babylon, and some of those very exciting synchronisms. So thanks again, Ken.
Hey, thank you very much. God be with you.